When you look through the history books, even those of more recent years, the pages are full of wars, and whether between ancient dynasties or modern states, the horrific consequences always leave readers wondering how such atrocities can happen. However, to learn from the past is of vital importance for the generations that follow, despite, on occasion, humanity seeming to make the same mistakes over and over again. In fact, hindsight is, of course, a wonderful thing, and this is never more true than when considering the major conflicts of the 20th century, and the Second World War in particular. It's all too easy to judge the decisions of our predecessors with comments like, "It was obvious what would happen," and "if only." And when it comes to Adolf Hitler, undoubtedly one of history's most notorious villains of the piece, we can all too readily express opinions about how he could have been prevented from bringing the world to the brink of destruction. Now, everyone knows that Adolf Hitler lost his battle for world domination, but the reasons for his eventual demise are truly fascinating and a salutary lesson for all mankind. This programme will explore why Hitler and his plan for a 1,000-year Reich failed to succeed, and the part this played in the eventual outcome of World War II. But before we begin with the declaration of World War II on the 3rd of September 1939, here's a very brief look at who Adolf Hitler was and how he came to be the most powerful man in Germany on that fateful day. Adolf Hitler was a fierce German patriot, despite being Austrian-born, who fought for his adopted country in the trenches of World War I. When the German government surrendered with the armistice of 1918, they were forced by the Treaty of Versailles to give up vast tracts of land, accept culpability for starting the war, and pay huge sums of money in reparation to the victorious Allies. For Adolf Hitler and many of his military compatriots, this was adding insult to injury, and they vowed to restore Germany to her former glory. Hitler proved to be a very skilled orator and soon took control of a growing political party that became known to the world as the Nazis when they stormed to power in 1933. These were difficult times, not only for Germany but for the entire world. The Wall Street crash of 1929 had resulted in economic depression everywhere, and for the German people, the difficulties of paying their war debt resulted in appalling poverty. So, when Adolf Hitler offered what seemed a viable solution, he rose quickly to public office. And if alarm bells were beginning to ring through Europe, neighbouring governments already had enough troubles of their own with the Depression to deal with, to look beyond their boundaries. The fact that Hitler had steadily rebuilt the German military and the armaments industry in direct contravention of the Treaty of Versailles should have been warning enough. But when he came to power, instigating a dictatorship that could not be challenged, the writing really was on the wall. With this complete control over Germany, his extreme views regarding racial purity and his hatred of the Jews came to the fore, and his plans to create an Aryan master race were put into practice. By 1936, Hitler was ready to start expanding Germany's borders to provide space for his new empire, and his opening gambit was to occupy the Rhineland, taken from the Germans in the Treaty of Versailles, and remilitarize the area. With the treaty now openly defied, Hitler established military dominance. When he was not challenged, he built upon his advantage and set his sights on yet more territory. After seizing Austria in 1938, Hitler did face questions from neighbouring democracies, but when he assured the world that he had no further territorial claims in Europe, the matter was allowed to rest. But within a very short space of time, Hitler was threatening Czechoslovakia, and the world was on the brink of war. With old alliances still in place, France and Russia were duty-bound to go to the aid of the Czechs, while the British would have to support the French. The then Prime Minister of Great Britain, Neville Chamberlain, favoured a policy of appeasement, and he brokered the Munich Agreement with Hitler, allowing the German Führer some further Czech territory in return for leaving the rest of Czechoslovakia alone. In Britain, Chamberlain and his promises of peace for our time had his dissenters, not least the politician Winston Churchill, who'd been warning of the danger Hitler posed for many years. And he was proved right in March 1939, when the Nazis marched into the Czech capital Prague without any warning. The world now knew without a shadow of doubt that Hitler could not be trusted, and when the Nazis stormed across the Polish border on the 1st of September 1939, a bitter battle was inevitable. And even Neville Chamberlain had no choice but to declare Britain at war with Germany. The French quickly followed suit, but Hitler had strategically signed a non-aggression pact with the Russians late in August 1939, wisely neutralizing any threat from the east. And as the autumn leaves began to fall, the world could only watch and wait to see what Adolf Hitler would do next. At first, there seemed to be something of a lull before the storm, but by April 1940, Hitler had invaded Denmark and Norway, before turning his attention to the Low Countries and France. Hitler was fast taking control of Europe, and it certainly seemed as if the Nazi swastika flag would soon be flying everywhere. However, as Hitler's speeding panzer tank divisions turned towards France, the German Führer, who had up until this point achieved his every goal, made the first of his strategic decisions that would ultimately lead to his losing the war. Ironically, the lead up to Hitler's first major military miscalculation came during his invasion of France, which forced the Allies into a very difficult position. By May 10th, 1940, Winston Churchill had been appointed Prime Minister, when Hitler's actions had meant the British public had lost confidence in Neville Chamberlain, and an all-party coalition was formed. As Hitler stormed through Holland and Belgium and into France, a huge problem loomed large for the new Prime Minister in London, as the British Expeditionary Force, better known as the BEF, were already in position on the continent, fighting alongside their allies. Some 250,000 British troops were part of the counterattack, but Hitler's strategy was nothing short of inspired. Hitler divided his army up into 3 groups, with each given a specific task. The first invaded Holland and Belgium. Another attacked the Maginot Line, while the remaining group advanced through the Ardennes forest. those attacking the Maginot Line were pretty much a decoy, keeping as many Allied troops as possible busy along the French-German border, while the real operation took place in the north of the country. The German invasion force in Holland and Belgium were most fiercely targeted by the Allies, which was exactly as Hitler had planned. While the Allied commanders believed that the Germans would not break through the Maginot Line and were confident that the forest of the Ardennes was impenetrable, most of their divisions, including many of the BEF, were sent to the north. But this was a serious error of judgment. Hitler had 50 infantry and 7 panzer tank divisions speeding through the Ardennes forest, storming their way into France over a completely undefended border. The surprise was so complete that the Allies, who were heavily engaged in fighting around the northern Belgian towns, were completely unaware of this threat gaining momentum in the south. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late to do anything about it. As the 19th of May dawned, the Germans had also reached the Channel, resulting in the Allies becoming totally surrounded on all sides, and as Hitler's tanks sped towards the huddled BEF soldiers trapped in the pincer movement, it looked as though in a matter of days the dead bodies of thousands of Allied servicemen would be littered along the beaches of northern France. Now, you could be excused for wondering how all this fits in with Hitler losing the war, because at this stage in his campaign, he definitely still had the upper hand, and was only days away from striking a crippling blow to his enemy. All that was required for the Nazis to complete the task in hand was to continue their offensive strategy, and not only would France be theirs, but also a significant number of Allied troops would have been taken out of the equation. Having been pushed right back to the beaches of Dunkirk, the stranded men could only await the inevitable, and the prospect must have been terrifying. But fate took a bizarre hand in the proceedings, as what could have been one of Hitler's most conclusive victories played out to its conclusion. Between the 24th and 26th of May, Hitler gave the order to all his troops to stop their advances just a few miles short of Dunkirk. This incredible decision by Hitler gave the Allied forces just enough breathing space to come up with and implement the biggest seaborne evacuation in history. With Winston Churchill in charge and his vast experience of naval matters, the British fearlessly launched Operation Dynamo, with the simple objective of getting as many soldiers as possible off the beaches of Dunkirk. The bravery of those that were sent over to begin rescuing the troops proved beyond compare, and even though at first only military vehicles were called upon, by the second day, virtually every British civilian with access to a seafaring craft, from fishermen and ferry owners to yachtsmen and pleasure boat cruisers, headed for France. As this huge fleet got closer to the beaches of Dunkirk, the soldiers waded out, shoulder deep in the water, to escape the German attack. Even so, the Nazis came back with a determined onslaught. But fortunately, by the time they realised their quarry was escaping, it was too late to prevent the vast majority of the soldiers getting away. Also, in the brief lull, the Allies had been able to strengthen their defences along the beaches, and the number of men being rescued was increasing by the 1,000 on a daily basis. Ironically, before these unprecedented events, a British Lieutenant General had said that nothing but a miracle could save the British Expeditionary Force. But by the end of May, it looked as if that was exactly what had happened. The initial evacuation plans had hoped to rescue about 45,000 of the troops from Dunkirk, but by the end of June the 6th, some 338,000 men owed their lives to Operation Dynamo. Without doubt, Hitler had won this particular battle, but he'd missed a crucial opportunity, because with the BEF and their Allied compatriots safely back on British soil, after so narrowly escaping the Nazi pincer movement, the question of why Hitler allowed this to happen still remains unanswered. Some historians believe that it was because the tanks, which Hitler relied upon for his blitzkrieg attack methods, were in desperate need of repair and could not be risked on the dangerous terrain around the beaches of Dunkirk. Calling a halt in order for the tanks to be repaired would make sense if Hitler had his eye on the bigger picture of the occupation of France. Also, the rescue mission embarked upon by the British was exceptional, and Hitler and his generals could have never anticipated such an outcome. Another school of thought is that allowing the escape was intended as a conciliatory gesture towards Britain, because Hitler would have preferred to negotiate a pact with Churchill rather than fight against him. Soon after Dunkirk, he even wrote, "At this hour I feel compelled by conscience once more to appeal to reason in England. I believe I am in a position to do this because I am not the vanquished begging favours. As a victor, I am speaking in the name of reason. I can see no reason why this war should go on." There were also reports that at this time, the German army had many officers who didn't share Hitler's ideology, who'd become embroiled in huge arguments with him over the invasion of peaceful countries. Because they questioned Hitler, it's been suggested that he called off the attack on the BEF, just to prove that he could do exactly as he chose. Equally, the view that Hitler had promised the Luftwaffe they should have the honour of finishing the campaign is another consideration, as is the fact that Hitler would undoubtedly by this time have been preoccupied with getting to Paris. He may simply have lost his focus momentarily, believing that there could be no possible escape for the BEF from Dunkirk. It's immediately evident that there has been much speculation about Hitler's actions at Dunkirk, but it could be as simple as up until this point everything had gone his way, and his ultimate belief that he was invincible may well have already been developing. Hitler had put himself in a position of power that was unassailable in Germany, and as his regime of terror continued, anyone who opposed him or gave advice counter to what the Führer wished to hear would be quickly silenced, invariably brutally, and more often than not, permanently. In truth, the real reason why Hitler halted the attack is unlikely to come to light, but tactically the repercussions are fascinating. It's impossible to conceive of any circumstances in warfare where it would be wise to allow over 300,000 enemy soldiers to escape, ultimately to fight another day. This isn't to say that once the Allies were back in Britain, they immediately rushed back over the Channel again to face Hitler's men, because there would not be a major military Allied presence in Western Europe until the D-Day landings in 1944. As you'll see, the battle for the Allies would be slow and hard fought. But what Hitler truly hadn't banked upon was the spirit of the British people and Winston Churchill's ability to motivate them. The escape from Dunkirk was a huge morale boost to all those oppressed by the Nazis, and it gave the British in particular the resolve to face anything Hitler threw at them, even the Blitz. However, in the immediate aftermath of Dunkirk, Hitler's campaign for world dominance continued undaunted, and soon after, a German-French armistice was signed as the Nazis took up their occupation of France on the 22nd of June 1940. Once France had fallen to the might of Hitler's stormtroopers, and most of Western Europe was veiled in the shadow of the swastika, the Führer turned his attention across the Channel to plan an invasion of the British Isles. Hitler was full of confidence when he said, "I prophesy the following: a great empire will be destroyed, a world empire that I never intended to destroy or damage. But it is clear to me the continuation of this struggle will end with the complete destruction of one of the two opponents. Mr. Churchill may believe this will be Germany. I know it will be England." But Winston Churchill refused to be intimidated and had no intention of bowing down to Hitler's evil regime. So when on the 16th of July 1940, Hitler gave orders for the invasion of the British Isles, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, it was time for battle to commence. At this stage, occupying Britain was Hitler's next logical step, because if he was going to win the war, it was a conquest that had to be made. However, what he'd failed to appreciate was the difficulty he was about to face, and the problems a stretch of water between himself and the British Isles was going to pose for the Nazi invasion forces. For a start, when Winston Churchill declared that he and the people of Britain would defend our island, whatever the costs may be. We shall fight them on the beaches, we shall fight them on the landing grounds, we shall fight them in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight them in the hills, we shall never surrender. He meant every word, and ultimately was about to become a major factor in the defeat of Adolf Hitler. Despite having had a political career that was littered with its fair share of disasters, the British Prime Minister was an excellent tactician, and as was already evident, also knew how to motivate his people in the most difficult of circumstances. If proof was needed of Churchill's superior military planning, his calm order for the destruction of the French fleet in North Africa is a perfect example. Churchill had calculated that Hitler would soon be planning an attack on Britain, and if he broke the French armistice and took control of their navy, then these ships could be used against the British. It was testament to his determination and view of the bigger picture, because Churchill knew innocent lives would be lost if he did sink the ships. But he considered it a necessary, albeit tragic, sacrifice, because the consequences of not taking action would be much worse. As expected, Hitler did indeed suspend Article 8 of the Armistice Agreement with France, which enabled him to take the ships. But having acted just days before, Churchill's actions had thwarted the Führer's plans, something that Churchill would develop an uncanny knack for. Even though the French ships were no longer available for the Germans to use, Hitler still had a great many resources at his disposal. As the Luftwaffe took to the skies and his sea captains planned on how they would take out the Royal Navy, the battle for Britain got underway. Hitler knew that if he was to land on British soil, then he would first have to disable both the RAF and the Navy, and as 1940 progressed, his schedule looked to be going to plan. The battle in the skies over the south of England between the two sides was fiercely fought by all involved, and the losses were high for the Germans and the British. However, both combatants knew the vital importance of the outcome. If the RAF were victorious, then Britain would surely be safe from attack. However, if the Luftwaffe got the upper hand, then a land invasion onto British soil would become a terrifying reality. By the end of July 1940, the RAF were losing to the Luftwaffe. However, none of their resolve was diminished, and their brave determination became a hugely significant factor. No matter how many German Me-109s and Me-100s flew over to Britain, the RAF, with their never-say-die attitude, always responded with counterattack after counterattack, and the courageous pilots of the Hurricanes and Spitfires helped to keep the Luftwaffe at bay. Apart from these wonderfully designed planes, the RAF also had other technological and tactical advantages over the Germans throughout this vital conflict. During the Battle for Britain alone, the British had developed the then revolutionary system of radar, which detected incoming German planes, so that the RAF could always get into position in the skies to meet them. The British also had a centrally controlled flight command base, ensuring that communication was always free-flowing. Interestingly, the German Navy used a machine called Enigma to encrypt communications. But thanks to British intelligence, the messages could be deciphered using a technique codenamed Ultra, which many people believe actually hastened the end of the war in Europe by at least 2 years. However, despite these advances and achievements, by the beginning of September 1940, the Allies were still losing the battle. The RAF had more losses in the air, and the Luftwaffe's missions to take out the naval and air bases were proving disastrous to British counterattacks. If Hitler could just maintain this plan of action for just a short while longer, then it looked as though victory would be his, and then a land invasion of Britain a foregone conclusion. Then came another twist in the tale of why Hitler lost the war. Because again, just as in the case of the Dunkirk evacuations, what happened next seems to have been down to the man himself making a critical error of judgment. As the RAF were within almost hours of being totally destroyed by the Luftwaffe, Hitler turned his attention to London and Britain's major cities instead. It's been suggested that the reason for this change in direction was as a result of one of his Luftwaffe bombers finding himself way off course. Pursued over London by an RAF pilot, the German dropped his bombs on the city, and Churchill reacted by retaliatory bombings over German cities, thinking this was how Hitler was choosing to proceed. Could Hitler have become so angry and incensed at the bombing of the fatherland to impair his ability to make decisions? It's impossible to say for sure, but the outcome certainly gave the RAF the time and space they needed to repair, regroup, and fight on. Despite the reprieve for the RAF, though, the consequences of Hitler's change in tactics cost the people of Britain dearly, with thousands killed in what became known as the Blitz. The Luftwaffe now faced much heavier losses as they were having to fly further inland. So, not only did this give the RAF much longer to intercept them, it also meant the German planes couldn't spend as long in the air over England before having to head for home to refuel. One of the final blows to Operation Sea Lion came on the 15th of September when Hitler ordered a huge daylight bombing raid on London, which did result in many buildings being destroyed. But more importantly, for the bigger picture, the Luftwaffe lost many more planes than the RAF, and it was becoming clear that the Nazis had underestimated their enemy. Also, Hitler and his generals had misjudged the time it would take to complete Operation Sea Lion, and as autumn turned to winter, the campaign had to be abandoned at least until spring 1941, which would bring with it the next viable tides when an invasion of Britain might be possible. This was indeed a positive turn of events, and despite the hardships the Allies joined in the conflict against the Nazis were suffering, the chinks were beginning to appear in Hitler's armour, and his enemies were at last realising that he was anything but invincible. However, to focus on Hitler's attempts to invade Britain would be to miss a major issue, as this was no longer just Germany's war, since a tripartite pact had been signed between the Nazis, Italy and Japan before the end of 1940. Perhaps more important still was the presence of the Americans, a traditional member of the Allied forces who had yet to enter this war. President Roosevelt had done everything he could to support the Allies from the sidelines, and in March 1941 agreed the Lend-Lease Act with Winston Churchill in Britain, effectively providing the funding for the Allies to continue resisting Hitler's advances. The global picture should certainly have given Hitler plenty to brood on, particularly as the Americans were in escalating conflict with his Japanese allies. But his next move, with the benefit of hindsight, gave him a much bigger problem to contend with. On the 22nd of June 1941, Hitler launched an attack on the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, in complete contravention of his non-aggression pact with Stalin, and it would ultimately result in his downfall. As the invasion got underway, 4 million troops and a huge backup force of tanks and planes attacked all along the Russian-German border. Hitler had most of Europe under his control at this point in the war, but the attack on Russia was as much a personal mission as it was about land. Hitler's agreement with Stalin had always been duplicitous, as his contempt for the Soviets and the Bolsheviks in particular was deep-seated, and he'd always intended to renege on the deal at the earliest possible opportunity. There was little sound military judgment to Hitler's decision, and he really had no idea what to expect from the Soviet army, going into battle blind and, quite shockingly, was prepared to take this huge risk in his personal quest to banish his Soviet neighbours from the face of the earth. Hitler even boasted that, "You have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." But the reality of the situation could not have been further from the truth. Just a short while into the campaign, some of Hitler's generals had grave misgivings, and one went as far as to tell him that the whole situation makes it increasingly plain that we've underestimated the Russian colossus, who consistently prepared for war with that utterly ruthless determination so characteristic of totalitarian states. But their concerns didn't stop Hitler, who was by now way beyond listening to good advice. Matters deteriorated further as summer gave way to autumn and autumn to winter, as Hitler quickly discovered that a Russian winter gave its native army a huge advantage over any invasion force. Then events in the Pacific conspired to pile greater pressure still on Hitler when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. President Roosevelt at last had the ammunition he needed to bring the USA into the war, and the very next day, this is precisely what happened. Suddenly, much of the advantage Hitler had gained by a process of attrition in Europe was wiped out, as the Americans brought with them fresh troops, armaments, vehicles, and the wherewithal to continue the fight. The destruction at Pearl Harbor mobilized the full wrath of America against both the Japanese and Adolf Hitler. The German Führer now had the might of Russia, America, and Great Britain locked together in an alliance against him. And wherever he turned, resistance to his planned 1,000-year Reich was gaining in strength every day. Nevertheless, on the ground in Russia, Hitler continued to recklessly pursue his plans, despite what was going on all around him. For added propaganda value, as 1942 progressed, Hitler had set his sights on Stalingrad, the city named after the notorious Russian leader. Although the city itself was not of huge importance to Hitler's operation, the prize it offered became something of an obsession. If he could conquer the city of his great enemy, then it would be an immense personal victory, and he threw everything that he could into the battle for Stalingrad. Needless to say, Stalin had equally strong feelings for this city and ordered that it be protected no matter what the cost. Because of this, coupled with a degree of inspired strategy from the Russian generals, Hitler's troops were drawn into a vicious street-by-street struggle for Stalingrad, which would eventually result in horrendous casualties for the Germans. Hitler's determination to destroy Russia was in turn damaging his own regime. However, he was now so far down this particular road that a retreat simply wasn't an option. Hitler was a driven man, following his own opinions, and his behaviour by now could often be extremely erratic. Some historians have surmised that Hitler was beginning to show the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, as there appeared to be a tremor in his left hand. However, it's never been proved that this was actually the case. The fighting in Russia would tie up much of Hitler's ever-decreasing resources for the rest of the war, and it would, in point of fact, be the Russians who reached Berlin first, before the Western Allies. By the time the Germans were forced to surrender at Stalingrad in February 1943, the Nazis really were coming under increasing pressure. Not that Hitler's defeat was at this point anything like assured. There were two arenas of war now, in Europe and the Pacific. But as the year drew to a close, the Allies were without doubt making great advances. Their power base had shifted from North Africa into Europe via the Mediterranean, with landings first on Sicily and then into Italy. The progress was slow but sure, although Hitler and his axes of evil were still very much a force to be reckoned with, capable of inflicting terrible losses on their Allied enemies. Then the moment for decisive action to end Hitler's reign of terror finally arrived, and in the early part of 1944, plans were put in place for the Allies to return to France in their quest to liberate Europe. Ever since Hitler allowed more than 300,000 Allied troops to escape the beaches of Dunkirk, it was always going to be just a question of time before his error of judgment would return to haunt him. What's more, the German forces in occupation in France were well aware of this, and as the tide turned in the Allies' favour, it was evident that sooner or later there would be an invasion force launched from the south coast of Britain. Because of this, much had been done by the Germans to build defences in preparation, but there was no way every inch of French coastline could be fortified. It was all a question of the Allies finding the gaps, and the plans for D-Day would rely on exploiting this weakness. In anticipation of the attack, the Allies had gathered together troops from all over the world, neutralised the German U-boat threat, practically destroyed the Luftwaffe, and constructed floating harbours and numerous landing crafts to ensure the army divisions could storm the French beaches. Every detail of the mission had been debated countless times, under the overall command of the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, because it was essential that this new front in Europe succeeded in pushing Hitler back towards Berlin. The preparations were meticulous and secrecy of the utmost importance, as an entire Allied invasion force travelled to the south coast of England, ready to make the sea crossing to France. As well as ensuring the Germans obtained as little intelligence as possible about what the Allies were planning before the big day came, an additional task was to feed the enemy false information, namely convincing Hitler and his generals that the invasion would come from Dover to Calais, the shortest and most logical route across the English Channel. This was achieved by bombers attacking the area around Calais, false radio messages, fake troops, and most importantly of all, double agents. The French resistance also played their part in preparations for the invasion, as the Allies prepared to land along the Normandy beaches between Caen and Cherbourg. Codenamed Operation Overlord, the huge fleet of ships set out to sea on the 6th of June, a day later than scheduled due to appalling weather, which nobody had anticipated being such a problem in June. The troops experienced very different conditions as they landed on the 5 carefully selected beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau and Salt. The Americans who landed on Omaha were the most unfortunate, as they met with an elite German infantry division on military manoeuvres, and the casualties were very high, while on Utah Beach they met hardly any resistance at all. Overall though, the Normandy landings were a success. By the end of the first day, an impressive 156,000 troops had made it onto French soil. The amazing deception plan by the Allies and the bad weather had totally taken the Germans by surprise, and again, just had happened at Dunkirk. By the time they realised what was going on, it was too late to do anything about it. Fate seemed to have been on the side of the Allies, especially as Hitler and his generals were adamant that an invasion wouldn't be likely before the weather improved. In fact, Erwin Rommel, who was in command of the defence of France, had returned to Germany for his wife's birthday. Consequently, the response to the D-Day landings was confused, to say the least, and when requests were made for a meeting with Hitler to ask for the release of the mobile reserves, they were informed that the Führer was sleeping and not to be disturbed. The D-Day landings proved more successful than the Allies could ever have hoped for, and they were to play a massive role in Hitler's eventual defeat. It was, effectively, the last point at which Hitler could have won the war. But as the Allies advanced from the west, and the Russians from the east, forcing the Nazis back to Germany was now a tangible goal. By the 14th of June, 500,000 Allied troops were in France, and just 3 days later, that number had doubled in size again. With such a huge army, the Allies steadily worked their way through France, liberating the people who'd suffered such oppression for so many years. This is not to suggest that the Germans under Hitler's command gave up without a fight. The battles were as bitter as ever, and there would be many more lives lost before peace could be restored in Europe. Even so, by July 1944, those closest to Hitler were realising that they were fighting for a lost cause, and their Führer, who'd made sure right from the early days that nobody could challenge him, was now incapable of turning the war back in the Nazis' favour. With the writing on the wall after the D-Day landings, a group of disaffected German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler and very nearly succeeded. The reprisals were swift and vicious, and even Rommel, who'd been so close to Hitler over the years, found himself in an untenable position when he was accused of being involved in the conspiracy, and took his own life as a result. It is, of course, a very telling sign when those around a dominant figure like Hitler lose confidence in his ability to lead. And looking at the position the Germans now found themselves in, it would take more than a new regime to put them back in the fight. Since May 1943, when Allied troops had taken control of North Africa and made their way up through Sicily and mainland Italy, the race for Berlin had been on, and by August 1944, many of these divisions had been able to link up with those who'd come ashore with the D-Day landings. As 1944 drew to a close, the Soviets had cleared much of Eastern Europe and were preparing for a full-scale invasion of Germany, and by this stage it didn't really matter what decisions Hitler made, as there was now no escaping his fate. Sadly though, like a wounded animal, Hitler and the Nazi officials were still capable of appalling atrocities, and many of those condemned to the concentration camps had to struggle harder than ever for survival. As his dream crumbled around him, Hitler fled underground to his bunker in Berlin, despite being urged by his officials to literally run for the hills, and it is here that he lived out his last few days. To the bitter end, Hitler refused to accept that his dream of a 1,000-year Reich had been crushed in just 12, and as the Russians closed in, Hitler finally married his long-term mistress Eva Braun, who'd also refused to flee the bunker as advised. She claimed she was one of the few left who was loyal to the Führer, and her devotion cost Eva her life because just a day after their wedding, the bride and groom, united in a suicide pact, killed themselves on the 30th of April, 1945. With Hitler dead and Berlin in the hands of the Allies, the war in Europe was finally over. VE Day was celebrated on the 8th of May, but of course this was still far from being the end of World War II. In the Pacific, the conflict raged on as the Japanese refused to consider the prospect of surrender. President Roosevelt had died in April 1945 and never saw the end of the fight against Hitler, in which he, like Churchill, had been so instrumental. But his successor, President Harry S. Truman, was left with a very difficult decision indeed. The war against the Japanese would be bitter fought, and the loss of American troops would be very costly indeed. So the option of a nuclear attack was taken, firstly targeting Hiroshima and then Nagasaki, at which point Japan did surrender on the 2nd of September 1945. The Second World War was over, and as the combatants started to count the cost, the true extent of Hitler's bitter legacy started to come to light. With more than 70 million dead, the lessons to be learnt from this conflict were carefully recorded in the pages of the history books, where we can only trust they will never be forgotten. In this programme, we've considered perhaps some of the more obvious reasons why Hitler lost the war, and the complexities of the military strategy of this incredible period in history are well worth looking into further. It's also important to point out that although Hitler was undoubtedly responsible for much of his own downfall, those who he found himself in direct conflict with were formidable opponents. Warfare, whether ancient or modern, is all about action and reaction, and thankfully the determination of such great leaders as Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt to stand up and fight for a free world eventually countered the evil regime that Adolf Hitler surrounded himself with. In his own words, Hitler declared that Germany would either be a world power or would not be at all, and it was a risk that he was prepared to take. Fortunately, he was wrong on both counts. That he was prevented from achieving global domination we know from the history books, but that Germany too has survived the terrible legacy of Adolf Hitler is equally good news for the future of world peace. it comes to 20th century history, there are few names as well known as that of Adolf Hitler, Germany's leader building up to and during World War II. However, unlike so many of history's heroes, Adolf Hitler has gone down in the record books for all the wrong reasons. The atrocities committed in his name resulted in the deaths of millions of innocent people, and images of emaciated figures struggling for survival in the concentration camps are synonymous with the reign of terror that Hitler dictated, leaving mankind struggling to make sense of how such a situation could have arisen. Understanding the past can, without doubt, bring hope for the future, and in the case of Adolf Hitler, the benefit of hindsight is a very valuable thing. Tracking his path from insignificance to world domination through to ignominious death in a Berlin bunker demonstrates how the delusions of one man can do irreparable damage if not kept in check, and confirms the old adage that absolute power corrupts absolutely. The classic image of Adolf Hitler, with slicked down black hair and square moustache, surrounded by swastikas and stormtroopers, is one that we're all familiar with. But as with every complex figure from history, to discover the real man behind the legend, we do need to go right back to the beginning. If that old adage that says, "Give me a child until he is 7, and I will show you the man," has any substance, it is certainly relevant for anyone considering the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler. It does come as a surprise to many people that Adolf Hitler was born an Austrian rather than a German, to parents living in the otherwise unexceptional little town of Braunau am Inn, and it was at 6:30 p.m. on the 20th of April 1889 that Adolf Hitler made his first appearance in the history books. Needless to say, the event is not celebrated here, and all you'll find as a reminder of Hitler's birth is a simple granite stone taken from the Mauthausen concentration camp, bearing a stark message which roughly translates as, "For peace, freedom and democracy, never again fascism, remember the millions of dead." On the surface, the Hitler family were fairly typical of the late 19th century era. Clara, Adolf's mother, was Alois Hitler's third wife, and there were already 2 children from his second marriage, Alois Jr. and Angela. And although Clara went on to give birth to 6 of Alois' children, only Adolf and his sister Paula survived to adulthood. However, right from the start, this had been a contentious union, as Clara was so closely related to Alois, a papal dispensation had to be obtained before they could marry. As an official in the Imperial Customs Service, Alois was well paid, but away from home a great deal of the time. And when he returned, his violence towards his son meant young Adolf had a far from ideal upbringing. His own words in later life are very telling indeed. "I never loved my father. I therefore feared him all the more. He had a terrible temper and often whipped me." The reasons for these beatings are largely unknown, but one theory is that Alois was determined to have his son follow in his footsteps and become a civil servant, while Adolf was set on a career as an artist. As is often the case with a violent disciplinarian father, Adolf sought refuge in the love of his mother, who he undoubtedly adored. Clara, in turn, poured all her affection into pampering her son, and in her eyes Adolf could do no wrong. When it came to education, looking at Hitler's frenzied concentration-making speeches, it's hard to believe that at school he was regarded as a lazy pupil. But when it came to reading about war, which he also loved to act out, he apparently became a great deal more animated. Interestingly, he always chose to play the underdog, and even from this young age, it's possible to see evidence of a trait that would see him determined to rebuild the German Empire from a position of extreme weakness after the First World War. By the time Adolf was 14, his father had died of a lung hemorrhage, and although Adolf was free from his father's abusive hand, with only his doting mother for guidance, Hitler lost any sense of discipline which he badly needed. As a result, Adolf was expelled from school and eventually persuaded Clara to let him opt out altogether at the age of 16 with no qualifications whatsoever. 2 years after the death of Alois, Adolf set off for Austria's capital Vienna in search of fame and fortune as an artist. When he was rejected twice by the Academy of Fine Arts, he attempted to make his living painting pictures from postcards to sell to tourists. But when his mother died of breast cancer days before Christmas 1907, Adolf Hitler was inconsolable. The devoted son hardly left Clara's side during her last weeks, and the family doctor said that he'd never before seen anyone struck with grief to the degree that young Adolf Hitler was. After his mother's funeral, he returned to Vienna, but found little to cheer him up, and although advised by the Academy of Fine Arts when he was rejected that his skills were more suited to architecture, he'd left school without the formal qualifications needed to be accepted for training. Even so, architecture would become an obsession for Hitler as Germany's Führer, and his architect, Albert Speer, was tried for war crimes at Nuremberg along with other prominent Nazis like Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess. Seeing images of Hitler at the height of his powers, without doubt he lived in comfort and luxury, his every whim catered for. But in the years after his mother's death, struggling to make his way in the world, it was a very different story. In fact, after becoming increasingly depressed with his failings instead of trying harder, in November 1908 he despondently took to the streets in a state of depression and anxiety. Hitler had lost it all. His mother, his dream of becoming an artist, was homeless and ended up spending 3 months on the streets, contemplating the future and wondering what to do with his life. But gradually, Hitler began to claw his way back into society, firstly seeking refuge in a shelter for the homeless, before settling into lodgings for poor working men. Some suggest that Hitler was a confirmed anti-Semite before he moved to Vienna. However, without doubt, the city was a hotbed of traditional religious prejudice, and he certainly came into contact with others who believed the Jews were responsible for the misfortunes of Austria. Whatever the origins of Hitler's notions of racial purity, an opportunity arose for him to leave Austria in 1913, when he inherited the last part of his father's estate, and he moved to Munich, saying that he'd always wanted to live in a real German city. The relocation also helped him avoid conscription into the Austrian army, something that he very clearly did not want to happen. Hitler was always adamant that he avoided conscription because he didn't want to join the Austrian army rather than due to cowardice. He'd always felt a connection with Germany, and when World War I broke out in 1914, he was overjoyed and later wrote, I am not ashamed to say, carried away by enthusiasm of the moment, I sank down on my knees and thanked heaven out of the fullness of my heart for granting me the good fortune of being permitted to live in such a time. With Hitler's love of warfare and his newly adopted homeland, Germany, he immediately volunteered to fight for the German army. This was a crucial turning point in Hitler's life and that of history. Up until this moment in time, fate could have taken the future dictator's fortunes in any direction. He could have continued painting, gone on to become a civil servant, or just disappeared into obscurity. But as a fervent young patriot going off to war, Hitler was destined to embark upon a path that would lead him and the world to the brink of disaster. As a volunteer, Hitler was certainly dedicated, earning various medals, never asking for leave, and living the life of a model soldier. Reports state, however, that people around him became annoyed by his eccentric behaviour and his unquestioning, unflinching patriotism towards the German cause. However, this most memorable period in his life, as he described it, soon ended when news of Germany's defeat reached him as he lay in hospital after becoming temporarily blinded by a mustard gas attack in 1918. Many years later, he recalled the moment in vivid detail. Everything went black again before my eyes. I tottered and groped my way back to the ward, threw myself on my bunk, and dug my burning head into my blanket and pillow. So it had all been in vain. It was yet one more disappointment for Hitler, and despite lacking a formal education, he vowed to rectify the situation and restore German national pride, no matter what the consequences. With the signing of the Treaty of Versailles on 28th of June 1919, Germany was forced to take full responsibility for the war, and with the flourish of a pen, the German Empire was destroyed. Hitler and a number of his compatriots couldn't believe what was happening, and he claimed that his adopted people were being stabbed in the back by socialists, Jews, and democratic politicians. It was time for Hitler, the political animal, to take over from the soldier. When he returned from the trenches to Munich, it was evident that Germany had lost its sense of direction. There were numerous political parties clambering to take control, and as a result, there were riots, assignations, and ever-changing shifts of power. Germany hadn't only been defeated in the war, the nation had also been so severely punished it was impossible for economic stability to be restored. Hitler found himself ideally placed to convince others that his radical views were perfectly acceptable, as Germany had been treated so badly by the rest of the world. Firstly, Hitler gave his support to factions of the army that wanted to overthrow the new republic, and in a very short time his determination was rewarded. The budding leader was handpicked to become a political instructor and was sent to learn about anti-Bolshevism, which is when his talent as a public speaker came to light. The political wing of the army could see Adolf Hitler's strengths as an orator, which would prove extremely useful for propaganda purposes, and he was sent to observe a small German workers' party with extreme nationalist views. On the 12th of September 1919, Adolf Hitler spoke at a meeting of the German Workers' Party. It went down so well that he was immediately asked to join the committee, and within a few months he'd taken over the leadership. The group is thought to have had only about 40 members at the time, but it was just the platform Hitler needed to launch himself from. In 1920, the name was changed from the German Workers' Party to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, in effect the birth of Nazism. Next, Hitler designed the iconic swastika symbol, giving the party an unmistakable image, then turned his attention to a weekly newspaper to help spread his propaganda around Munich. After a short while, the Nazis had recruited thousands of ex-soldiers to form their own private army, the SA, and support for the party and its leader escalated at a remarkable pace. Alongside the German nationalistic cause, Hitler was also able to present his anti-Semitic and other equally extreme views to the growing Socialist Party. So it was that Adolf Hitler became a very popular leader, accepted as being the saviour of the German people, without anyone realising the dangers his distorted opinions could pose. It was almost an overnight success, and the newfound power quickly went to Adolf Hitler's head. He demanded a no-questions-asked policy, and anyone who didn't agree with Hitler was swiftly and, on occasion, violently expelled. Then, on the 8th of November 1923, along with 600 members of the SA, he burst into the Munich beer hall, where the leader of the Bavarian government was addressing a large crowd. Hitler jumped upon a table and, shooting his revolver into the air, shouted, "The National Revolution has begun." But Hitler had banked on the army, police, and the rest of the government supporting the coup. Only when it came to the crunch moment, they failed him. Undeterred by his embarrassment, Hitler was still confident that he could steal power in Munich. So the next day, he tried much the same thing again, only this time he was arrested. For many leaders, this would have been the end of their career. However, Hitler had a great deal of support in Munich, and consequently was only given a minimal sentence of 5 years in prison and served just 13 months. What's more, Hitler was completely unrepentant and used his time in prison to mastermind his grand plan. He dictated to his deputy Rudolf Hess the book Mein Kampf, which translates as My Struggle, and he hoped this book would be a Bible for his followers. He laid down his plans, his vision, and cemented his view of the master race. From his prison cell, Hitler also decided that his political party must be completely transformed and expanded nationally, because the Nazis needed to spread throughout Germany to contest the existing political system and take complete control. It wasn't long before the Nazis had become a seemingly legitimate political party, and when the Wall Street crash hit America, and the Great Depression spread far and wide during the early 1930s, the Nazi ideology seemed very attractive indeed to the poverty-stricken German masses. Within 10 years, the Nazi Party had increased the number of seats they held in the Reichstag from 14 to 288, and on the 30th of January 1933, Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor, ready to put the next phase of his plan into action. Although an election was scheduled for early March, it would be fair to say that democracy had already broken down. Communist meetings were banned, the Catholic Centre Party had their meetings disrupted, and the election rallies of the Social Democrats were often violently broken up. would seem that you either supported the Nazis by choice or force, and a climate of terror already reigned. The Reichstag today looks as if nothing could ever have troubled its dignified exterior. But on the night of 27th of February 1933, a ferocious blaze ripped through the building, destroying the Great Hall and leaving the German seat of government in ruins. The Nazi Party used this disastrous event to their advantage, blaming the communists for starting the fire, justifying their introduction of a state of virtual martial law and, in effect, a total ban on the communists. Any threat to Hitler in the elections had been neutralised, and it's been suggested since that it was the Nazis who started the Reichstag fire in order to discredit their opponents. Not surprisingly, the Nazis, with Adolf Hitler at the helm, stormed to power, and to ensure there was no chance of democracy making a comeback, other political parties were dissolved, the press was taken over, and a Nazi occupied every seat in the rebuilt Reichstag. The final blow to democracy came with the death of President Hindenburg on the 2nd of August 1934, when a law was passed proclaiming the presidency dormant, transferring the role and its powers to Hitler as head of state. He became Führer and Reichskanzler and supreme commander of the military machine he was building, in direct contravention of the Treaty of Versailles. Officers were forced to swear an oath of allegiance not to the Constitution, but to Hitler personally. And from this moment onwards, it was impossible for anyone to legally challenge anything Hitler chose to do. In just 20 years, Adolf Hitler had gone from a volunteer soldier to the Führer of a right-wing dictatorship. But this was only the beginning, and it wasn't long before the extremes Hitler was prepared to go to put Germany back on the map began to surface. In his opinion, the German peoples needed Lebensraum, which translates into living space, and it was his aim to create enough living space for an explosion in the nation's population. To do this, he'd have to take land that belonged to other countries, and Hitler's first step towards his goal came on the 7th of March 1936, when he sent his troops into the Rhineland, placing a military presence in territory that had once belonged to the old German Empire before being taken away by the Treaty of Versailles. With the benefit of hindsight, it's obvious that Hitler's blatant breaking of the treaty should have been dealt with at the outset, but nothing was done. Also, because he was giving the German people a new sense of pride, by the end of 1936, Hitler's popularity had reached new highs. The military was expanding, pacts had been agreed with Italy, and it looked as though there'd be no stopping Hitler's rise to power as he turned his attention to global domination. Since becoming a notable political figure in 1933, Hitler had concentrated on foreign policy, and in particular the Treaty of Versailles, or as he renamed it, the Slave Treaty, which he was obsessed with destroying. But it wasn't only foreign policy that was the order of the day for Hitler. He was also changing German society, and this is when his deeply entrenched personal prejudices started to come to the fore. Family planning clinics were closed, so more babies would be born. He gave newlyweds a copy of Mein Kampf to take on honeymoon, and entertainments were purged of anything the Nazis didn't approve of. Jews and other minority groups were victimised as Hitler moved towards his goal of a pure Aryan race, and education was streamlined so that the young were indoctrinated with Nazi ideas. And in May 1938, Hitler even commissioned the design of the perfect family car for his master race to drive. The car in question we know today as the Volkswagen Beetle, and from these early beginnings in Nazi Germany, the people's car went on to become one of the world's most iconic vehicles, although in the 21st century, very few people realise that it was Adolf Hitler who was responsible for its creation. Now, in Hitler's favour, the VW Beetle was a creditable contribution to world history. But the same could never be said of what was to follow, because Hitler was preparing for war. The new targets were Austria and Czechoslovakia, and at last Europe, particularly Great Britain and France, sensed that Hitler was becoming a problem. On the 12th of March 1938, after much bullying of the Austrian government, German troops occupied Austria without firing a single shot and swiftly turned their guns towards Czechoslovakia, but still no action was taken to stop Hitler in his tracks. Up until this point, Hitler's rise to power had gone unchallenged, but there were warning bells ringing in Britain, with Winston Churchill adding his voice to concerns. Nevertheless, Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, favoured a peaceful settlement and flew to meet Hitler to negotiate a diplomatic agreement. The German Führer very plainly told Chamberlain that he wanted the Sudetenland incorporated into Germany, or there would be war. As the British Prime Minister was so keen to appease, he actually persuaded the French and the Czechs to agree to Hitler's demands. Chamberlain flew back to London, clutching the signed Munich Agreement. He proudly declared that it would mean peace for our time, while the Sudetenland was handed to Hitler on a plate. Now, Hitler had even more power, and as Churchill had predicted, his promise of peace was nothing but a hollow sham. On March the 15th, 1939, the Nazis stormed into Czechoslovakia to take up occupation. The Czech troops were no match for Hitler's military machine, and simply laid down their weapons as the Germans roared in. Soon after that, Lithuania also fell, and by now the world knew that Hitler could no longer be appeased, and the time for direct action had now come. War in Europe was imminent, but Hitler was at the height of his manipulative powers, and in August 1939 he signed a non-aggression pact with the Russians to guarantee he'd not be attacked from the east. Known to the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, Hitler's contempt for the Russians was almost as fierce as his hatred of the Jews, but at this point he was well aware that he did not have the manpower to take on the British, the French, and the Soviets. He said, "I shall stretch out my hand to Stalin at the common frontier, and with him undertake to redistribute the world. After Stalin's death, he is a very sick man, we will break the Soviet Union. Then will begin the dawn of the German war." Chilling words, but for the time being at least, Hitler was safe from an attack on the Eastern Front and in a position to march on Poland. This was key because Britain and France had signed a pact with Poland to support them in the event of a German invasion. and even Chamberlain had no way of using appeasement to stop Hitler in his tracks this time. The 3rd of September 1939, at 11:15 a.m, a seemingly peaceful Sunday morning in Britain, one of the most fateful dates in world history was etched on the memories of millions of people. The lawnmower stopped, and families crowded around their wireless sets to hear Prime Minister Chamberlain deliver one of the gravest messages in modern history. However, Hitler had bought himself a great deal of time and was well prepared. The mighty Nazi war machine looked unstoppable. Soon after, the occupation of Poland, Denmark and Norway also fell, and as Hitler stormed through mainland Europe, his powerful panzer tank divisions ripped through the countryside. Although enjoying the protection of the English Channel, the people of Britain were well aware that Hitler would soon look towards their island, and Chamberlain no longer inspired confidence for a nation at war. On the 10th of May 1940, Winston Churchill was invited to form a wartime coalition government, and as Prime Minister, he would lead the British into battle. Hitler now had a worthy adversary, but his star was still in the ascendancy, and it seemed the self-appointed Führer could, from a strategic point of view, do no wrong. With Hitler's troops deep in Holland, moving ever more menacingly towards France, the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, sent by Churchill in support of the French, suddenly found themselves in grave danger. The German troops had unexpectedly made a thrust through the Ardennes, splitting the Allied forces in two and engulfing them on both sides. The French troops and the BEF were trapped in northern France and pushed back to the beaches of Dunkirk. With the Nazis closing in from all sides, it looked as though, in a matter of days, Hitler's forces would wipe them out. But as the Allies fell back to the beaches to await their fate, the German tanks stopped short of Dunkirk. Had Hitler lost his nerve? It was hardly likely, as more than 300,000 men escaped the clutches of the Nazis to fight another day between the 27th of May and the 4th of June 1940. History has been left with a fascinating, yet probably unanswerable question. Some believe that Hitler let the troops go as a peace offering to the British, because he still hoped for an Anglo-German pact. Others think it was because he was more interested in getting to Paris and securing the occupation of France that made him momentarily lose his focus. It has also been suggested that Hitler had promised the Luftwaffe that they should have the honour of finishing off the BEF as sitting ducks on the Dunkirk beaches. Whatever the truth, it was a key error of judgment, and although still a victory for the Nazis, it was the point at which Hitler's fortunes started to turn. as the strategic considerations, it is possible Hitler's undoubted arrogance played a part in allowing more than 250,000 fighting men to slip through his fingers. Hitler said of the event, "It's always good to let a broken army return home to show the civilian population what a beating they had." This was evidently a man confident of victory and underestimating the enemy. What he failed to appreciate was that by letting a broken army run home, you allow them to fight another day. And a few years later, when the Allies returned to France, Hitler was close to being defeated, and the D-Day landings of June 1944 marked the final point when the Germans could actually have turned the war back in their favour. But as the BEF were rescued from Dunkirk in 1940, the D-Day landings were a long way off, and following Hitler's actions step by step will reveal how, from a position of such strength, even the mightiest can fall. With most of Europe now under his control, Hitler did look towards Britain when he realised, with Winston Churchill as Prime Minister, there was never going to be an Anglo-German pact. Hitler had always said that the British and German people belonged together racially and traditionally. However, Churchill saw things very differently. So Hitler issued a directive on the 16th of July 1940 to begin the invasion of the British Isles, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, a campaign he believed would be concluded before the winter set in. As the British summer reached its peak, the Air Force took to the air, while the Navy watched the seas as the Battle of Britain got underway. Hitler knew that the only way to conquer Britain would be to get his speeding panzer divisions onto dry land. But before this could happen, both the RAF and the Royal Navy would have to be destroyed, and in that order. Dogfights and bomb attacks on RAF bases, Hitler came closer than he knew to achieving his objective. But a strange succession of events distracted him at the precise moment he could have secured victory. The Luftwaffe concentrated predominantly on bombing the airfields of southeastern Britain. However, during one raid, there was an incident when a German bomber found himself way off course. RAF fighter had pursued him, while in the skies over London, the Luftwaffe pilot dropped his cargo of bombs. Acting quickly, Churchill, assuming that Hitler had changed his strategy to target the British capital, retaliated by sending the RAF to bomb German cities. Hitler was incensed and really did begin an attack on London that became known as the Blitz, as well as other major British cities, including Plymouth, Coventry, Manchester, Sheffield, and Southend. Now, although this was bad news for Britain's city dwellers, it did give the RAF the breathing space they needed to get back into the fight. And with the Luftwaffe having to fly further inland to hit their targets, they were a great deal more vulnerable. Without viewing the bigger picture properly, Hitler had made another snap judgment that would cost him dearly. With the summer over, on the 17th of September 1940, Hitler had to postpone Operation Sea Lion because the tides would not be suitable for an invasion by sea until spring 1941. Unused to having his plans thwarted, Hitler threw everything he had into the Blitz, determined to break the spirit of the British people. But again, he underestimated his enemy, and more importantly, the rare skill of Winston Churchill to motivate the people. The cracks in Hitler's abilities as a military tactician and fatal flaws in his personality were beginning to show. Even by this early stage, he would not tolerate criticism from any of his advisors, convinced that he was invincible, and just like the Roman emperors who he hoped to emulate, Hitler's megalomania was destined to destroy him. After the disappointment of Operation Sea Lion, Hitler turned his gaze to the Soviet Union, no doubt looking for a quick, decisive victory to keep his demons at bay. Hitler rushed headlong into his plans to invade Russia, reneging on his non-aggression pact with Stalin, without fully appreciating how difficult it would be to open up the war on two fronts, especially when already resources were spread very thin. It was becoming obvious that this war was one man's personal crusade, and his decision to send 3 million troops into the Soviet Union, with the benefit of hindsight, can only be described as a huge error of judgment. No one, least of all Hitler, had any idea what the Soviet military was capable of, and Churchill famously described the Russians as a mystery wrapped up in an enigma. Unbeknown to the outside world, Stalin had totally transformed his military forces. When the German army charged across the border on the 22nd of June 1941, they were in for the shock of their lives. The fighting in Russia tied up a huge number of Hitler's men for the rest of the war, and as his rationality became steadily more questionable, the odds were rapidly stacking against him. As 1941 progressed, another headache developed for Hitler as a result of his alliance with the Japanese. When they attacked the US Navy stationed at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, not only did Hitler have the British and the Russians as enemies, but he now had the full might of the American military directed against him as well. True, he was still on the offensive and controlled most of Europe, and during 1942, his persecution of the Jews and other minority groups reached alarming new heights. The atrocities being committed in the concentration camps, including Auschwitz and Belsen, became daily more inhuman. And when news reached the Allies of the scale of the horrors, the genocide ordered by Hitler resulted in a heightened determination to defeat him. That Hitler's absolute power had by this time corrupted him absolutely was beyond question. And during 1943, his erratic behaviour and bizarre judgment even set alarm bells ringing amongst his own. His left hand had also started to shake uncontrollably, which many historians have since speculated was due to the onset of Parkinson's disease, but this has never been proved. The tide had turned dramatically against Hitler, and although like a wounded animal, he was still capable of doing an incredible amount of damage, By early 1943, his fate was sealed in Russia, and his fall from power became simply a matter of time. The Battle of Stalingrad developed into arguably the bloodiest battle in human history. In the depths of the Russian winter, the German Sixth Army was completely destroyed, and Hitler could do nothing as he became vulnerable to attack from the Russians on the Eastern Front. After the German surrender in Stalingrad, the losses in battle were beginning to pile up, even though Hitler remained adamant that Germany would be victorious. His desert fox, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had lost the Second Battle of El Alamein in North Africa late in 1942, which freed up the Allies to invade Sicily just a matter of months after the surrender of Stalingrad, before moving on to mainland Italy. Now, although the writing was already on the wall, in terms of Hitler's demise in so many respects, just as he continued to believe himself invincible, the Allies were still far from confident of victory. Despite an upturn in their fortunes as 1944 began, the carefully planned invasion of France by the British, American and Russian leaders would be key to the outcome of the war. When D-Day came in early June, even Eisenhower, the American charged with overall command of the Allied operation, prepared two speeches to cover either the success or failure of the mission. The D-Day landings began 24 hours later than planned, due to unseasonable weather on the 6th of June, when the largest seaborne invasion in history left the south coast of Britain as 155,000 troops crossed the Channel. Of surprise was absolutely crucial, and the Germans failed to take heed of their own intelligence reports. Firstly, they believed the attack would come from Dover, targeting Calais, and secondly, the bad weather convinced them that the Allies would wait for calmer seas. Even Rommel, who was in charge of defending the German position in France, went home to celebrate his wife's birthday, so sure were they that the invasion was some time off. However, when the onslaught of Allied troops arrived on the beaches of Normandy, a German defeat was inevitable, as Hitler's depleted armies were now pushed back on three fronts. The Russians were giving it their all in the east, the Allies were making great progress, working their way up through Italy, and now with the beaches between Caen and Cherbourg swamped, a carefully planned pincer movement could begin. Although the Germans continued to fight back fiercely, the Allies were fast closing in, and Hitler, running operations from Berlin, was urged by his closest aides to flee the city. But as he stubbornly refused to accept their advice, his top officials knew that the war was over. It was simply going to be a question of when. But Adolf Hitler, facing a downward spiral, continued with more conviction than ever, and failure was simply not an option, as schoolboys of 15 and 16 years of age were rounded up in Germany and sent as reinforcements to the fronts, where the carnage carried on destroying lives for no purpose whatsoever. By the end of January 1945, the Soviets were only 100 miles outside of Berlin. To the west, the Anglo-Americans were on German soil. Hitler had lost almost every territory that he'd gained during his campaign, and all he could do was throw everything he had left into the defense of Berlin. For those who'd followed Hitler with unquestioning loyalty, the fact that he stubbornly entrenched himself in his Berlin bunker by the time April came must have been both alarming and frustrating. A rational man would no doubt have been looking to escape to fight another day, but not Hitler. Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, took matters into his own hands and attempted to agree a surrender with the Allies directly. Hermann Göring, Hitler's officially agreed successor, suggested he take charge, as the Führer was in no position to run things from the bunker. Hitler's response was to sack both men, expel them from the Nazi Party, and brand them traitors. Interestingly, Hitler's companion in the bunker was Eva Braun, a woman who's been the source of much fascination to those trying to make sense of the man behind the legend that was Adolf Hitler. Eva had been involved with Hitler since 1929, and from 1936 onwards she'd been part of his household at the Berghof, his country retreat near Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps. They'd never married because Hitler was afraid of alienating his female admirers. But when Eva, like the Führer, was encouraged to flee to safety, she chose to stay with Hitler, claiming she was one of the few people left who'd stayed loyal to him. As the Russians got ever closer, on the 29th of April, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun were married in the bunker. But the 1,000-year Reich that had been Hitler's dream lay in tatters after a mere 12 years. And the day after the wedding, the bride and groom committed suicide rather than face capture. Shockingly, even at the end, Hitler showed no remorse, claiming his defeat had been due to the treachery of the officer classes in the German army, and even more bizarrely, he actually blamed the start of the war on the Jews and those who worked for them. Nevertheless, with the gunshot ringing out that killed Adolf Hitler, the war in Europe was effectively over. By the time the Russians arrived, bunker staff had partly cremated the bodies. But the most tragic find for them would have been the 6 beautiful, innocent children of Joseph and Magda Goebbels. Along with Hitler, Goebbels and his wife had killed themselves after taking the lives of their children in a suicide pact. As Europe celebrated VE Day on the 8th of May 1945, the war continued in the Pacific, predominantly between the Americans and the Japanese, until the newly appointed President of the USA, Harry S. Truman, gave the order to drop the atomic bomb, firstly on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki, forcing the final surrender, which marked the end of World War II. So we've also come to the end of our journey, charting the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler. Here, at the German cemetery at Le Combe, set back a short distance from France's Normandy beaches, made so famous during the D-Day landings of 1944. The salutary lessons of the true horrors of World War II and the carnage instigated by the obsessions of one man are clearly visible for all to see. It's all too easy to count the cost of Hitler's atrocities by considering how he treated those he made his enemies. However, the real tragedy is that his own people suffered horribly as well. In the 21st century, understanding how the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler came about will hopefully promote peace and a spirit of reconciliation, which this cemetery at Le Combe epitomizes. Over 20,000 German soldiers are commemorated here, many of them just schoolboys conscripted into the nightmare of Hitler's master plan for world domination. If ever proof was needed that absolute power corrupts absolutely, then the mass grave at the heart of this moving memorial is an eternal reminder to one and all to beware of anyone, soldier, statesman or politician, who offers the ultimate prize in exchange for democracy. There is also a price to pay, and in the case of Adolf Hitler, the cost truly was borne by the entire world. The man you're looking at is without doubt one of history's most dangerous dictators. And still today, many years after his death, on a global scale, even children born in the new millennium can tell you that this is none other than Adolf Hitler, the leader of Germany's bid for supremacy in World War II. Benefit of hindsight, it's quite difficult as we view this archive material to grasp just how much damage this one man could do. And the question always asked again and again is quite simply, why wasn't he stopped? If Adolf Hitler had been assassinated, how many innocent lives could have been saved? But history is rarely straightforward and never simple. You'll discover as we look more closely at those who did try to rid the world of Adolf Hitler, some actually from amongst his own ranks, why the task of killing this one man was such a difficult objective to achieve. Right from the outset, it's important to appreciate that Hitler was well aware that he was a target for the assassin's bullet, even from the beginning of his ascendancy to power, and he did actually voice how great a risk he believed he constantly faced. One day, a completely harmless man will establish himself in an attic flat along the Wilhelmstrasse. He will be taken for a retired schoolmaster, a solid citizen with horn-rimmed spectacles, poorly shaven, bearded. He will not allow anyone into his modest room. Here he will install a gun, quietly and without undue haste, and with uncanny patience he will aim it at the Reich Chancellery balcony hour after hour, day after day, and then one day he will fire. Hitler may not have got all the facts right, especially as it would be a bullet from his own gun rather than one from a lone assassin that would end his life when he committed suicide as his enemies advanced on Berlin in 1945. But his certainty that attempts would be made on his life were very accurate indeed. The history books are full of Hitler's atrocities and the brave attempts of the Allied forces determined to stop him in his tracks. But ironically, few of us are even aware of the brave resistance in Germany to Hitler's tyranny. In a climate of absolute fear, standing up to be counted, voicing opposition to Adolf Hitler was a dangerous business that cost many their lives. But as the memorials testify, a German resistance did exist and were responsible for the best known of the assassination attempts on Adolf Hitler that on a number of occasions very nearly succeeded. The small group of dedicated freedom fighters who took the brave step to resist Hitler's evil regime and risk all for what they believed in were led in the first instance by Henning von Tresckow, who famously claimed that Hitler was not only the archenemy of Germany, but the archenemy of the world. Von Tresckow's views were very clear, and he demanded that action be taken, not only to neutralize the threat of Adolf Hitler, but also to prove to mankind that there were Germans who were as opposed to Hitler's evil doctrines as the rest of the free-thinking world. He said, "The assassination must be attempted at all costs. What matters now is no longer the practical purpose of the coup, but to prove to the world and for the records of history that the men of the resistance movements dared to take the decisive step." Every person who signed up to help the rebels knew that if they were caught, they'd be branded as traitors and executed. But despite this deadly danger, the risk was worth taking, because they believed that without intervention, Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich may well become a terrifying possibility. Evidently, the passionate response Hitler's skill as an orator had on the masses that crowded into the stadiums and arenas to hear him speak didn't only work in his favour, and there were those amongst his own people who saw the dangers that Hitler's lust for power posed. Looking at Berlin and the Reichstag today, which was at the very heart of Hitler's rise to power, it's hard to believe that the remarkable events that happened here back in the 1930s and 40s could actually have been possible. But this was an extraordinary period in the history of the world, and it's impossible to consider Adolf Hitler and what he did without first setting him in the context of the age in which he lived. Hitler's spectacular rise to power in German politics is even more incredible when you realise that he was actually Austrian-born. As a struggling artist in Vienna, Hitler failed miserably, and for a time found himself living on the streets. Much of his plight he blamed upon the political climate in Austria, and his deep-seated hatred of the Jews also developed at this time, where he was often in the company of other like-minded anti-Semites. Disillusioned with Austria, Hitler greatly admired Germany, and when he came into a small inheritance, he moved there. And when World War I broke out, he applied for permission to fight for his adopted homeland, and developed a fierce and ultimately dangerous patriotism for Germany. Hitler fought in the trenches of World War I and was even temporarily blinded after a gas attack shortly before the armistice of 1918. However, when news came that the German government had surrendered, Hitler and his like-minded compatriots believed that they had been stabbed in the back by socialists, Jews, and democratic politicians. Matters were made much worse, in Hitler's opinion, when the Treaty of Versailles made Germany accept the blame for the war and pay huge reparations to the victorious Allies. It was a trigger for revolution, and on his return to Germany, Hitler entered the political arena, leading others who felt as stabbed in the back as he did. The result was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which, with Hitler at the helm, soon became known as the Nazi Party. As early as 1923, Hitler made an unsuccessful attempt to overthrow the German government and was given a prison sentence of 5 years, of which he only served 13 months. Already he had ardent followers, even in prison, one of whom was Rudolf Hess. And it was to Hess that Hitler dictated his book Mein Kampf, which translates as My Struggle. In it, he set out his plan for a German master race, creating a nation where entire social groups would be destroyed, including Jews, homosexuals, and communists, as well as those of ethnic origin. If this wasn't dangerous enough, Hitler also laid out his vision for restoring land to Germany stripped away in the Treaty of Versailles, and expansion of his empire to provide living space, or as he called it, Lebensraum, for the true Aryans he demanded the new Germany be peopled with. Striking a chord with many disgruntled Germans who faced further hardship after the Wall Street crash of 1929 sent the world into economic depression, Hitler's rise to power was alarmingly swift. But right from the very start of his campaign, there were people in his own country who opposed him. It was here, under the arches of the Brandenburg Gate in central Berlin, a place where so much history has been played out, that Hitler and his devoted followers first celebrated his political dominance in 1933 with a torchlit procession through the streets of the city. Coordinated by Joseph Goebbels, who would become one of Hitler's closest associates and the mastermind behind the Nazi propaganda machine, the imposing group met together in the nearby Tiergarten before lighting their torches and setting off at 7 p.m. to the thunderous beat of the drum. With an impressive military display marching through the city, Hitler gave notice of his intention to put Germany back on the world map, in complete defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. But despite Hitler's dramatic show of strength, not everyone was singing the Führer's praises. He may well have been the new leader of Germany. However, the people of the country had not put him there of their own free will. And when you look a little more closely at how Hitler achieved his position of power, it's easy to appreciate why alarm bells were starting to ring. As Hitler had failed to take over Germany by force with a coup years earlier, in 1933 he decided to try more legal avenues to get his Nazi party voted into power. But just days before the elections, on the 6th of March, there was a huge fire that tore through the Reichstag. The Nazis were quick to blame the communists, and almost gained a majority, feeding off the frenzy of anti-communist hysteria that the episode generated. It was, nevertheless, enough for Hitler to push through the Enabling Act, and in effect for Germany to become a one-party state, removing all remaining political opposition. Many historians today believe that Hitler and the Nazis were actually responsible for the Reichstag fire. So it's hardly going to come as a surprise that there were German citizens who experienced these incredible events firsthand who were of the same opinion, even if they were in no position at this stage to do anything about it. With nobody now able to prevent Hitler from doing as he chose, he wasted little time in putting his plans for Germany into action. For the master race Hitler dreamed of to be created, he would need to employ the evil process of ethnic cleansing to rid Germany and the nations he intended to conquer of any person who did not fit into his view of perfection, including those who were elderly or the disabled, or simply not of Aryan descent. His persecution of the Jewish race was relentless, as he set about eliminating what he perceived as the problem. And sadly, for a people that throughout history had lacked an official state and already suffered centuries of atrocities, much worse was about to come. Nothing, however, could have prepared the Jews or the rest of the world looking on for what Hitler had in store. And as he progressed in his campaign for a 1,000-year Reich, his crimes against humanity became increasingly more shocking. Firstly, the Jews were ostracized, banned from public spaces, struck off from professional registers, and had their businesses destroyed. As Hitler's power grew, so did his appalling campaign against not only the Jews, but all those he considered undesirable. And he had entire communities banished from towns or put into ghettos, before setting up the horrific concentration and death camps that would result in what history has recorded as the Holocaust, one of the darkest and most tragic episodes in the entire history of mankind. Hitler had snatched power so completely, any of the German people who were shocked and horrified at what they saw happening could do nothing to stop him. Those who did speak out against Hitler soon discovered that his personal army, known as the SS, were dangerously loyal and quickly disposed of anyone who displayed anything but complete adoration for Hitler. With another of Hitler's compatriots from his failed military coup, Heinrich Himmler, in charge of the SS, the brutality with which any dissenters were dealt with proved a frighteningly effective deterrent. But it wasn't only the civilians who were silenced in this way. The German military were unable to question any of the orders they were given. But even in the days before World War II was officially declared, there were those who certainly doubted the wisdom of Hitler's tactics. In a very short time, though, any chance of speaking out was even more restricted when Germany's President Hindenburg died on the 2nd of August 1934. Hitler incorporated the powers of the president with those he already possessed, and forced his officers to swear an oath of allegiance to him personally, rather than the state, forcing anyone with grievances to plot in secret rather than resolve any difficulties with negotiation. As the 1930s progressed, while Hitler was busy engineering his Aryan master race, he also turned his attention to his obsession with Lebensraum, fueling his determination to invade neighbouring countries. The Nazis marched first into the Rhineland and remilitarized this part of the old German Empire. Then Austria and Czechoslovakia soon found themselves under Hitler's control. The Wehrmacht, which was the combined German army, navy and air force, had no choice but to do Hitler's bidding. But with such a long and distinguished history, there were those who disliked the Führer's methods. A number of the more mature regiments still held on to the older, chivalric ways of conducting warfare, a far cry from any of Hitler's ideologies. There was great controversy over the way in which Hitler was invading peaceful countries, and this distressed many of the older army officers. The Wehrmacht, however, had no other option but to follow Hitler's orders. He was their leader, and any challenge would now be considered treason, and tied by the principles of obedience and loyalty, resistance would have to wait to have its day. But opposition to Hitler's tactics was far from being widespread, and many soldiers, sailors and airmen were totally convinced by their Führer's compelling arguments, and were more than happy to fight and die for the cause. It seems incredible now that such a relatively short time ago, a man like Adolf Hitler could rise to such power, not only in Germany but throughout Europe. Every time he snatched more land for his empire, the rest of the world hoped that he'd go no further. But when he forced his way into Poland on the 1st of September 1939, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Neville Chamberlain, gave Hitler until 11 a.m. on the 3rd of September to withdraw his troops. When Hitler failed to do so, Britain, quickly followed by France, declared war on Germany. It's interesting to consider the suggestions that even in the early stages of the war, Hitler faced questions about military strategy from his own troops. And one theory regarding his actions while completing his occupation of France in 1940 is very telling indeed. Hitler's invasion of France came on all sides, with his tanks breaking through the Ardennes forest to the south, while at the same time completely surrounding the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, along with Allied servicemen from France and Belgium, who were in the north, putting up whatever resistance they could. Hitler was on course for a resounding victory, as the Allies were forced together towards the beaches of Dunkirk. There appeared to be no escape for them. Then something seemingly inexplicable happened. Just a few miles short of Dunkirk, Hitler called his troops to a halt and provided the Allies with a window of opportunity for one of the most incredible rescue missions of all time. Operation Dynamo was launched from the south coast of England, and every seafaring vessel that could be mustered, from naval battleships to yachts, ferries and pleasure cruisers, set sail for France, and in a matter of days, Hitler had allowed more than 300,000 Allied servicemen to escape, quite literally, from under his nose. One of the theories as to why the miracle of Dunkirk was possible was due to there already being pockets of resistance springing up within the German army. By giving the order to halt, Hitler had perhaps intended to show everyone within the Wehrmacht that he was in total command, even damaging his own campaign to assure his position of supremacy. Whether or not he was popular had never been one of Adolf Hitler's concerns. What he was concerned about was effectiveness, and everyone doing precisely as he said without question, whatever the cost to himself or anyone else. Now, on balance, there are many other plausible reasons why the German tanks stopped short of Dunkirk. But in terms of explaining how conspiracies were beginning to develop within Hitler's own ranks, this could be a valid argument. Also, it has to be noted that soon after Dunkirk, Hitler's critics did seem to fall back into the shadows, as the German Führer really did hit the peak of his territorial and social power. By the time the German-French armistice was signed on the 22nd of June 1940, Hitler was totally in the ascendancy, and this support from his people and the Wehrmacht was growing on a daily basis. Hitler had shown nearly everyone that he was the man to make Germany a great power again, and for now, in his supporters' eyes, he could do no wrong. If there was any dissent in the fatherland towards Hitler, it was generally no more inflammatory than a cursed muttering. However, despite Hitler's success and his growing support, there were still small groups of soldiers who didn't believe in the war and wanted to do more than just raise an eyebrow at Hitler. But they knew enough of their leader to appreciate that timing was everything, and patience would have to be a virtue until support for Hitler fell away. One conspirator remarked that there was no point in acting while people sing hosannas. It can only make sense when they scream for Hitler's execution. And as a theory, it had a great deal of merit. Just as the rebels had hoped, as the war progressed, Hitler started to make some serious errors of judgment, and because of this, support for the resistance movement slowly began to grow. Firstly, there was the disaster that was the Battle for Britain, bringing with it huge losses for the Luftwaffe and damaging some of the most evangelical public support for Hitler. The Nazis targeted British naval and Royal Air Forces, so that a land invasion could be attempted, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. To begin with, Hitler's plans appeared to be working perfectly, but when Hitler wanted revenge for British bombings of German cities, he completely changed tactics and lost any chance of achieving his objective. On September the 15th, 1940, after a disastrous daylight raid on London, Hitler had to reluctantly call off all action with regards to Operation Sea Lion. Although this was a huge blow for Adolf Hitler and his plans for world domination, it was a boost for rebels. But this was only the first of a number of contentious issues, and Hitler's plans to invade Russia would put many German servicemen into an impossible situation, where the casualties would be devastating and the conditions they would face truly appalling. Operation Barbarossa was a gross miscalculation by Hitler, as his obsessive hatred of the Russians clouded his judgment, and as the campaign went from bad to worse, audible criticisms were finally voiced about Hitler amongst both the military and the civilian population. Also, misgivings about Hitler escalated as the atrocities that the Nazis were perpetrating against the Jewish prisoners in the concentration camps and Russian POWs began to come to light. Many German soldiers were sickened and disgusted by the actions being carried out in the name of their beloved fatherland, but Hitler had put himself in such a position of power, there was nothing they could do about it. To make matters worse, in 1941, a General Staff instruction was given out that stated, Bolshevism is the deadly enemy of the National Socialist German people. The struggle requires ruthless and energetic action against Bolshevik agitators, guerrillas, saboteurs, and Jews, and the total elimination of all active or passive resistance. From this point on, the crimes against humanity that were once the province of the SS and Nazi party members were now being forced upon the average German soldier, and many were horrified at what they were being ordered to do. The conspirators had been waiting years for the right moment to carry out an effective assassination plot, and ironically, it was in the German Army Group Center where the most likely group of rebels to succeed formed, under the leadership of Colonel Henning von Tresckow. The colonel had fought courageously for Germany in the First World War, was a lieutenant by the age of 17, and left the military academy as the best cadet of the year. He was a model soldier, and just the kind of man Hitler needed serving the Reich. But his sense of justice was stronger than his loyalty to the Führer. Von Tresckow was shocked by Hitler's illegal actions and the aggressiveness of his campaigns before and during World War II. And although he remained in the army, by 1939 he was already certain that the murder of Hitler was the only way to save Germany and her people from a terrible fate. When he told a friend that this will still have an effect in hundreds of years, and it will not only be Hitler who's blamed, but rather you and me, your wife and my wife, your children and my children, that woman crossing the street, and that lad there kicking a ball. He was serving notice that the Führer's fear of being assassinated was now more than a distinct possibility. Bravely, von Tresckow set up his staff headquarters as one of the bases for the resistance movement, and appointed a number of close friends and colleagues to cautiously spread the word of what was being planned. Slowly, the conspirators grew in number, until there were enough supporters to begin plotting against Hitler. Every possible method of killing Hitler was explored, ranging from a straightforward shooting to a full-scale bomb attack, while the prospects of destroying his plane or poisoning him were not ruled out. But every attack they launched failed, and only served to highlight just how difficult it was to get close enough to Hitler to kill him. Von Tresckow realized that they needed a supporter that would have close contact with Hitler if an assassination attempt was to be successful, and that was only the beginning, because it would also be necessary to have the backup of a full-scale political coup. It was no good just killing Hitler, as another of the Führer's officers, such as Heinrich Himmler, the commander of the SS, would simply take over where Hitler left off. To save Germany, there would need to be a negotiated peace with the Allies, so a complete power shift was required to quickly fill the void that a successful assassination would leave. With the Russian campaign seriously damaging Hitler's popularity, another major factor came into play when the Americans joined the Allies after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Support for the conspirators increased, but with each assassination attempt that failed, everyone became increasingly anxious, as they knew that the longer they took, the less chance they would have of it ever succeeding. Von Tresckow, by this stage, was leaning heavily towards the idea of assassinating Hitler during one of his visits to the Eastern Front, knowing that on these occasions his target would be out in the open. After 1941, Hitler became more and more of a recluse, and public sightings were practically non-existent. The Führer's fear of assassination meant that wherever he could, he placed himself behind a thick wall of security, so every chance that was missed was getting costlier. Then, in August 1943, a new rebel appeared on the scene, who had the perfect credentials to gain the close access to Hitler that to date had been denied the conspirators. His name was Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg. He was a brilliant young soldier who'd also been harbouring a desire to rid the world of Hitler since learning of the atrocities inflicted on the Russian POWs and the Jews and other victims of Hitler's genocide in the concentration camps. Von Stauffenberg had once had great enthusiasm for the Nazi regime, been awarded the Iron Cross First Class, and was considered to be an all-round model soldier. At the start of the war, although he did not agree with all Nazi Party policies, he did remain loyal to Hitler, and when he first heard of rebellious plots in 1939, he was disgusted at the thought of conspiring against Germany. This, however, all changed, because as Hitler made more and more critical errors of judgment and his crimes against humanity escalated, von Stauffenberg lost all respect for his leader and came to the conclusion that Hitler needed to be removed from power. Von Stauffenberg became further convinced after almost being killed in April '43 while directing a tactical withdrawal from North Africa. The attack by American fighter bombers cost him the use of his left eye, his right hand, 2 fingers on his left, and peppered his back and legs with shrapnel. His doctors didn't expect him to survive the day, but just 3 months later he was discharged with a clean bill of health and a new outlook on life. Von Stauffenberg was convinced that his survival was more than good luck. He believed that he'd been spared for the divine purpose of ridding the world of Adolf Hitler. With his new resolve, von Stauffenberg got to work straight away, and as soon as he'd settled into his new staff role with the Reserve Army in Berlin, he began working on Operation Valkyrie. This top-secret operation was, in fact, a legitimate official emergency mobilization plan, and was even cleared by Adolf Hitler himself. The original plan set out actions that would allow the reserve German army to deal with any possible internal disruptions, from uprisings by the foreign workers to an SS revolt. Military districts across Germany had been given details of this plan, and it laid out how they would join forces with army barracks, training facilities and reservists to secure certain key locations around the country. Using Operation Valkyrie, the reserve German armed forces could quickly calm any disturbance, take control, and ensure that the fatherland remained secure. It was von Stauffenberg's responsibility to update the plans and keep them active, putting him in the perfect position to prepare for a coup. With a little tweaking, Operation Valkyrie would provide Germany with the leadership it needed in the event of Hitler's death, enforcing a state of martial law while a new power structure was put in place. With von Stauffenberg now on side, the coup that the conspirators had been dreaming of finally looked like a reality. Von Tresckow was now confident that power could be seized, and had enough people waiting in the wings, ready to take charge of Germany once Hitler was disposed of. Of course, they still had to get rid of Hitler first, and this was proving increasingly more difficult. As the Allies fought back with increasing success, there were numerous assassination attempts made on Hitler between 1943 and early 44, but still nothing seemed to work. Here, along Unter den Linden in Berlin, they even tried to use history's first suicide bomber to kill Hitler, while he was on the briefest of visits to the Berlin Armory. Rudolf Christoph von Gersthoff carried a bomb with a 10-minute timer concealed in his coat into the armory. And when Hitler arrived, the bomb was activated, and Gersthoff did his best to remain in close proximity to the Führer. But after just 3 minutes, Hitler made his excuses and left by the side door, and Gersthoff was left to defuse the bomb before he was blown apart. Again, the conspirators had been foiled by Hitler's unpredictability and the increasing difficulty of getting close to him. As soon as this plan failed, the rebels hatched another scheme, which would be a bomb plot using a much shorter fuse, but again they failed. Von Stauffenberg constantly offered to play the assassin, but he was considered too important for the implementation of Operation Valkyrie after Hitler's death to risk losing, and also his physical injuries hardly made him an obvious choice. But matters were fast becoming desperate. The Allies were gaining ground at an incredible rate, and also it was rumoured that the Nazi security services were getting close to blowing the conspiracy plans wide open. However, with the end of the war looking close, Hitler became more dogmatic, more ruthless, and the rebels knew that if they could end his reign of terror just one day earlier, they would be doing the world a great service. By June 1944, Soviets had cleared the Nazis from Russia and were heading towards Germany. The Western Allies had landed in Italy and were starting the liberation of Europe from the south, while in the west, the D-Day landings along the beaches of Normandy were well underway. Thousands of Allied troops pushed their way into France as part of Operation Overlord, and more Germans than ever realised that the war was lost, and it was only a matter of time before the Allies marched into Berlin. Despite the fact that von Tresckow was less active due to the loss of momentum, von Stauffenberg was still determined to implement the assassination of Hitler. The one hurdle that had always dogged otherwise meticulous planning was getting close enough to Hitler to actually kill him. But on the 20th of June 1944, von Stauffenberg received the news that would give the rebels the chance they'd been waiting for. Von Stauffenberg was to be promoted to full colonel, serving as Chief of Staff to the Commander of the Home Army. This new role not only meant that he was in charge of raising, training and supplying the troops on the various fronts, but also meant he was required to report to Adolf Hitler personally, and von Stauffenberg was ready, willing and able to make the most of the opportunity. As it was von Stauffenberg's job to send men to the front to fight, he knew that Hitler would want to see him often, as the German forces were now heavily engaged on all sides. With the Allies closing in at great speed, the deployment of what reserve troops the Germans had at their disposal was a matter of supreme urgency. This, of course, was great news for von Stauffenberg, who knew that the more times he met with Hitler, the more opportunities he would have to carry out the task he'd been charged with. The first opportunity came on the 6th of July, when von Stauffenberg was travelling to Berchtesgaden in the German Alps, where Hitler had his country retreat. All von Stauffenberg took with him was a briefcase, which held a few personal items, papers, a change of shirt, and right at the very bottom, 2 explosive devices destined for Hitler. Von Stauffenberg had hoped to persuade a fellow rebel to detonate the bomb during a presentation of new uniforms to Hitler, but his request was denied, and with time fast running out, he realised he would have to personally take responsibility for killing Hitler. Consequently, every time von Stauffenberg travelled to a meeting with Hitler, his important briefcase went with him. But it was risky, because he knew he could have been caught at any moment. Sometimes Hitler wouldn't be there. Other times, various important members of the cabinet, who also were to be targeted, were not present. And in an attempt on the 15th of July, after a bomb had been set, it was removed from the room by another conspirator, most likely because Goering and Himmler were not in attendance. Time was running out for von Stauffenberg, and he couldn't afford another missed opportunity. The war was close to a military end, and the SS were also fully aware of the resistance movement, and the pressure was increasing daily. There'd been 3 journeys in just 1 week, with a bomb in the briefcase, risking exposure and certain death, and von Stauffenberg knew that the next opportunity might well be his last. On the 20th of July 1944, another meeting was set up, and this time von Stauffenberg was determined it would be Hitler's final act. The location was to be within the walls of a briefing room inside the perimeter of Wolfschanze, one of Hitler's wartime bases in northern Poland. Just before von Stauffenberg entered the briefing room, he excused himself to prepare for the meeting. With his adjutant, Lieutenant von Haften, he began to arm the bomb that so much rested upon. But von Stauffenberg was interrupted by another assistant, who told him that he was needed in the meeting room straight away, so he quickly placed the live bomb in his briefcase and left to face his destiny. Von Stauffenberg wanted to be 100% sure that this time the assassination would succeed, so he asked to be sat next to Hitler so that he could hear the Führer, blaming his injuries from North Africa for a degree of deafness. It worked, and he placed the briefcase on the floor and then nudged it slightly so that it was only about a metre from Hitler. With everyone present, the meeting finally got underway, but von Stauffenberg would still need to give the order for Operation Valkyrie to begin, so his next task was to escape the briefing room before it was blown apart. As soon as he dared, he left to deal with an urgent phone call to Berlin, and luckily no one grew suspicious. Then, at 12:42 p.m, there was an earth-shattering explosion. As one eyewitness put it, "In a flash, the map room became a scene of stampede and destruction. There was nothing but wounded men groaning, the acrid smell of burning and charred fragments of maps and papers fluttering in the wind." Von Stauffenberg had been waiting for an agonizing 3 minutes for the explosion. When it finally came, he made his escape to Berlin, believing Hitler must be dead. Now all that he thought remained for him to do was to set Operation Valkyrie in motion, and and then the coup would be complete. But there was to be no coup, no early end to the war, and no funeral for Adolf Hitler. Almost unbelievably, the assassination had failed yet again, and Hitler was still alive and well. But as the rebels didn't know this, Operation Valkyrie went ahead as planned. It would be 3 p.m. before the radio orders were sent to all army groups stating that the Führer is alive, in perfect health. And the message also told them not to implement Operation Valkyrie. A short while later, Hitler was completely back to his old self, and apart from temporarily losing the use of his right arm, pierced eardrums and torn clothing, he was practically untouched. It would seem that Hitler's belief that he was invincible was correct, because not only had he already escaped various assassination plots, he had now also escaped a huge bomb blast with hardly a scratch. However, there are far more tangible explanations for his survival. It's thought that after von Stauffenberg left the room, another officer moved to the briefcase next to a heavy oak table support, because it was in his way when he stretched out his legs. The strong support, along with the 4-inch thick tabletop, was therefore able to take a huge amount of the blast, and possibly save any number of lives. Then add to the equation the fact that the room the meeting was held in allowed for much of the blast to disperse through the windows and walls. Had it exploded in an underground bunker which would have contained the force of the bomb, it would have been far more deadly. Lastly, and perhaps most significantly of all, von Stauffenberg only took half the bomb with him into the meeting. In the rush to get to the briefing room, von Stauffenberg forgot to set the second plastic explosive, and worse still, forgot to put it in his briefcase. Chances are, if just one of these things hadn't happened, then the plan would have worked perfectly. But sadly, it didn't, and Hitler's hunt for the rebels began in earnest. It's been estimated that almost 7,000 people were arrested in connection with the bombing, and many hundreds were later executed as a result. A great number of them were hung with piano wire on meat hooks, and their photographs shown to all the military as a deterrent, while others were sent to the death camps or simply shot. Von Stauffenberg was captured a day later on July the 21st, having been betrayed by a fellow rebel. He was simply marched out into a courtyard and killed without ceremony by a 10-man firing squad. With von Stauffenberg gone, the last hope of the resistance movement was sadly put to rest. The coup and accumulation of many years' work had failed, and Hitler was able to drag out his evil war into April 1945, when he committed suicide as the Russians stormed into Berlin. This marked the end of the war in Europe, and VE Day was celebrated on the 8th of May, but it would be September before the Japanese surrendered in the Pacific, bringing this terrible period of world history to an end after 7 years of bitter conflict. Even though Operation Valkyrie failed, and many true and faithful Germans died as a result, the resistance did at least show the rest of the world that there were honourable men to be found amongst the most wicked. The brave conspirators who made up the resistance may well have thought that their efforts had been in vain, but they were true to themselves, even if it cost them the ultimate price. Perhaps the last word on the subject should go to von Tresckow, the man responsible for so many assassination attempts on Hitler, and without whose bravery and inspiration many German patriots would never have been given a voice. Shortly before he took his own life, the day after Operation Valkyrie had failed, von Tresckow said, "Now they will all fall upon us and cover us with abuse. But I'm convinced now, as much as ever, that we've done the right thing. In a few hours' time, I shall stand before God and answer for both my actions and the things I neglected to do. I think I can, with a clear conscience, stand by all I have done in the battle against Hitler." And there is no better epitaph for all the conspirators who risked everything during World War II in the name of truth and honour.